Ukraine putting the finger at the Kremlin for the murder of another Putin critic.
Babchenko's murder made international headlines. Ukrainian special security pointed a quick finger at Russia, who just as quickly denied it.
This fashion of blaming Russia before final investigation results that is set by those who conduct international affairs this way is very sad.
Then the head of Ukraine's security apparatus stunned assembled media in Kiev when he announced it was all a dramatic setup and Babchenko was alive. To gasps in the room, they revealed that 2 months earlier they'd learned of a plot to kill Babchenko and with his help staged his death.
Firstly, I would like to apologise for what you've all had to go through, because I've buried friends and colleagues many times. Also, I would like to apologise to my wife for the hell she has been through in these last 2 days. Olechka, I'm sorry, but there were no other options.
They then released video of the arrest of the man they say was hired by Russia to arrange the murder after paying off the person he thought had done it, who instead had tipped off police. Babchenko's colleagues at a Ukrainian news outlet shrieked at learning he's alive. But now come the questions.
The Ukrainian security services, as far as we're aware, knew of a plot to kill him, but they've done a sting operation instead. Why?
CBC journalist Alex Shrinson has reported extensively on stories in Russia and Ukraine, including the death in 2016 of former Russian journalist Pavel Sheremet, whose killer has never been found.
Okay, so let's start with Babchenko because, we know of him now, many of us, but hadn't heard of him previously. Tell us why he would have been the target of an attack by Russia in the first place. What's his history?
He's actually a very prominent Russian journalist living in exile in Kiev. He started out as a soldier. He was conscripted into the army. He went to the First Chechen War in the mid-90s. And I guess he liked it so much that he actually volunteered to go to the second one, which is actually the war that brought Putin to power. Whatever he saw, whatever he did, got him very disappointed, disillusioned with war. And he became very anti-war. And slowly and gradually, he became very anti-Putin regime. And he wrote about that. And he is a very good writer. I mean, I don't know, he just has great talent, I guess. And so he became a fairly prominent journalist for certain investigative mainstream publications in Russia. At a certain point, he became probably the most aggressive critic of Putin. I mean, one of the examples is that when the Red Army Orchestra plane crashed a couple of years ago on the way to Syria, and everybody died, he wrote that it serves them right because they were essentially serving the interests of the state and performing for the army in Syria, which had no business being there. And eventually, last year, it became so dangerous for him, and there were calls for stripping him of his citizenship or putting him into prison for being a traitor. He just essentially ran away in Ukraine, and Kiev is an obvious place because people speak Russian there.
So, completely believable when it seemed that he had been assassinated. And then you and I, our offices are in fact right across from each other. You were the first one to go, oh my God, he's alive, and this crazy story starts to unfold. I mean, what was your own reaction to seeing all the details, that this was this elaborate sting and all the details that started to flow from it?
Well, it's very gradual. You absorb it. You want to hear more details. You want to see how legitimate this was, why they needed to do this. Did this actually happen? Was there a real plot to kill him? All of this is very believable because we all know that there have been other people, other critics of Putin who've died, both in Russia and outside its borders. So that part of it, and of all the people who kind of qualified for this, he was Exhibit A. The rest of the stuff, obviously, you learn a little bit more and how somebody was, they were very lucky in the sense that the handler went to the wrong guy. He went to a hitman who actually was a Ukrainian patriot. And so then you can easily understand how this was very tempting for them, if this happened 2 months ago, as they say, to play along with this. This was a perfectly seemingly legitimate sting operation that made a lot of sense.
Now, there's been criticism from some corners of both sides. So let's start with Babchenko. Some saying, as a journalist, he should never have played into something that was essentially fake news. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's naive, I would say. It's a little bit holier than thou. I mean, he's a human being first, who's a target of an assassination before he's a journalist. And they come to him, presumably they came to him and said, here's the situation. They don't tell him all the details, and they say, this is what we need to do in order to catch these people and save your life. Now, there are two aspects to this. saving his life, obviously, I mean, that's a given. But the other thing is, given the way that he's been writing and his opposition to the Putin regime, anything that would embarrass them, anything that would expose them for what they're doing, I'm sure he would be the first guy for it. He's also, as you know from his going to war, he's a guy who takes risks. So this is, I don't blame him for this, and I'm not surprised that he went along with this.
Okay, so then there's the other questions around the Ukrainian security service. Did they have to approach it this way? What's in it for them?
Well, there are a couple of stages here. I mean, obviously, the first stage is just simply the sting that would make it so that the handler and whoever was who hired him would think that this is really happening.
They have footage of the guy taking money,
right,
saying,
exactly,
"Oh,
exactly.
Here's the money for the hit."
So clearly, that part of it made every bit of sense. That they would go along, they would save him, they would obviously not try to find a different hitman. They wouldn't tell the guy, "Well, no, I'm not going to do it." So that made every bit of sense. The real question, is why did they need to go through with it at the very last moment? I mean, they could have simply announced to the world that this is what happened and we arrested a bunch of people. One of the reasons that they're claiming right now, and we don't know otherwise, is that they got a bit of information, and quite a bit of useful information at the very end, once the hitman reported to the handler that the deed is done. For example, they got a list of 30 names, 30 other names, they claim, who were also on a future hit list, presumably by the same hitman. That's pretty significant if it's true. They also claim that there was more information, which I can imagine that perhaps the handler at that point, when the deed was done, made some kind of contact with his Russian handlers, maybe emailed them, maybe phoned them, that he hadn't done before. That's possible. They also are saying that for the trial, it's good to have a situation where final money exchanges hands at the very end when the deed is done.
That's pretty strong evidence.
Yes, there's also. My view is that there is something else here, which is more intangible and something they probably wouldn't admit, which is that for the last 4 years, Ukraine has been under siege. There's a war going on. Russia is fighting a war in Ukraine. It's snatched Crimea. It is fighting in eastern Ukraine. 10,000 people plus have died. They needed something. They needed a triumph of some sort. And they probably saw this as an opportunity to basically say, F you to Russia. This, I think, is probably a big part of that. The other thing also is that they have been accused for a long time of not solving these cases, and accused correctly. The one you mentioned about with Pavel Sheremet, it hasn't been solved. So this was an opportunity for them to make a big splash, a big spectacle.
Isn't one of the other consequences of doing it this way is that we're here talking about it. The whole world is talking about this story. Hard to say if we would have been if it had stopped short, if it hadn't been such a dramatic event.
Of course. I mean, there's no way that if the Ukrainian Secret Service 2 days before had called a press conference to announce that they had interrupted a plot by Russia to kill Babchenko or anybody else, this would have been news maybe in Ukraine for a little while. People maybe even would have been skeptical. They wouldn't necessarily have believed it. This way, the entire world is talking about this for 2 days, both before. It's a little bit, I mean, the analogy I use is you're having a perfectly good day, then you lose your wallet, you're really upset, then you find your wallet, and you're thrilled by that. And nothing has changed. It's exactly the same situation. But this event creates interest, creates excitement, creates some kind of triumph. And I think that they needed and they felt that this was worth doing. And we'll see, based on the evidence they provide, how legitimate it was.
Really interesting. Thanks, Alex.